people would like to say briefly who they are. So for my context, I'm working in a CAM service as well, and I work with looked after children and children on the edge of care within kind of social services settings. Don't know if I zoom over to you, Danny, just to say a quick hello.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Danny. I'm a trainee at Lancaster, but I've just started, and one of the contributors to the book.
Yeah, and you, Lizette?
Hi, yes, lovely to be with you. I'm Lizette. I work on the University of Hertfordshire programme, and I work with young people in schools.
Yeah. Like a magician, I'll conjure up Sasha.
Hi, I'm Sasha. I'm a trainee at Sheffield, and when I contributed to the book, I was still an AP. I'm now in my third year of training. It's lovely to see you all here.
Right, so thank you. So we're going to dip back in out, back and forth rather, throughout the kind of presentation. So I'm going to talk a bit about what the values and kind of background around pulling the book together and the kind of hopes within that. Throughout the presentation, I'm going to weave a bit of an overview of the book as well. Won't spend too much time on the content exactly, but I hope by giving you a bit of a kind of flying tour, you'll see some of these values and principles and kind of themes within some of the content of that book as well. We're going to be thinking about that kind of navigating of selves. We're going to have a bit of a reflective activity, so thinking about what am I trying to do in the world. We can have some thinking spaces, so this kind of mirrors the angle for the book as well, where we try to invite you to engage in a series of kind of reflective activities and thinking spaces to really start to activate those personal, kind of professional and political selves as you kind of read through. But hopefully we'll do similar today as well. Then we're going to have a kind of mini presentation within a presentation as well from Danny and Sasha around talking about the personal political voicing of lived experience. Going to be thinking about practicing what we preach, so to speak, and how that's going to look is perhaps in terms of self-formulation. Another kind of thinking space. So you can see we're squeezing in a massive kind of taster today around, hopefully as a kind of springboard for a continuing thinking space beyond the immediate kind of webinar today. And then, I don't know, maybe we could have a mass dance right at the end where everyone's screens are on, but we're going to stop talking and then we're going to start to dance. Don't worry, don't leave. That's not actually what we're going to do. Yeah. Okay, so in pulling together the book, there was a sense that actually there's a lot of there are a fair few books out there, and thinking what are the kind of dominant voices and what are the less heard kind of narratives, or what kind of conversations conjure up a bit of curiosity and thinking, okay, if we looked at this from a different angle, what would be the stories told? So at the heart of this book was really about what would the people living in the moment of kind of training or aspiring to get onto training tell us about clinical psychology, and how can we shape that kind of vision going forwards as well. So lots of people within the book, the authors, lots of them are or were at the time of kind of writing, perhaps in training or pre-training. We have some trainers and kind of teachers in there too. Myself, I was a trainee at the time of putting this all together as well. And parallel to this as well, there was this angle of thinking around lived experiences, perhaps that's of mental health difficulties, or whether that's of facing adversities. And I think there's a kind of political context to that, particularly the time of, well, I'd say particularly the time of my training, but I think that's kind of continued ever since. But there have been really significant events outside of the immediate clinical psychology bubble that really seem to infuse and influence the conversations we're having and the sense we're making of what resources we had available to us and how it would help people. Could we help people? Should we help people? Do we need to look broader? And so on. So many wanderings within that, which really came together to build this sense that what could clinical psychology become? Okay, so as you see on your screens there as well, the book also is about this sense of invitations for people to kind of reflect and get involved. So part of that process, I guess, is trying to use mediums such as kind of Twitter or Instagram to get people involved a little bit in the conversations. And it's been a real pleasure to be able to see people engaging with some of the activities or opening up different types of conversations, which include being critical of even what they've read within the book. So that's the idea here of hashtag surviving clinical psychology, is to dive in, muddle about with some of the ideas and perhaps see what possibilities kind of unfold thereafter. So that includes today, I guess. You're getting a taster of what this webinar could become and the book could become, and the ideas within. So please do feel free to join the conversation. Okay, so just thinking about the values and principles within the book. As I say, we kind of start with this idea of invitations, not direction. So there was this real drive, I think, of participation within the book. And I wondered around, how does something static, like something you would read, how does that become live and evolving? And it's through this idea of inviting the reader to start to make sense, see through their different lenses, and then apply that in practice too. Yeah, alluded to already, I think, is that inclusion and collaboration was really key to this book as well. So we have over 30 authors in the book, and I've always got on the to-do list to count how many contributors as well that we have, because weaved throughout each of the chapters there will be friends, colleagues, different services lending something in small but really significant ways throughout. So there's a big focus on people's own, authors' own kind of experiences of distress, mental health services, therapy as well, to the point of examples of perhaps lessening this idea of using vignettes within kind of clinical training or clinical psychology, to perhaps consider the potential for our own experiences that we can use in a way to kind of model a new approach to clinical training and the way we work with one another and relate. And we'll say more on that later, of course. Key again is this idea of social justice and community psychology. So a psychology that is outreaching and not necessarily all just about the mind. And these are lots and lots of the kind of ideas within the book. It tries to speak to this sense of how can we use the skills that clinical training may enable us to kind of apply and use beyond just our immediate kind of clinical setting. So within that, yeah, and this is where the invitation comes so fruitful, I guess, is this sense that we can be creative and critical, and serious and playful. And there's lots of systemic kind of influences. So a sense of curiosity, perhaps opening up rather than closing down explorations of what clinical psychology could become. This idea of irreverence, so being able to perhaps hold our own ideas with some sense of questioning, perhaps applying that critical kind of serious, kind of playful and creative lens onto our own investments within clinical psychology too, and perhaps to invest in one idea for a while, see how useful it becomes, and then be able to step back and apply a different investment for a while. There's a sense of being challenging this idea of neutrality, and I think that feeds into the focus on social justice and community psychology as well, which kind of introduces that sense of a kind of ethical and moral kind of clinical psychology. And I think all of these ideas and values kind of have fused together, and it creates something in which hopefully we can start to work together much more, in a sense that we really take seriously the role of clinical psychology in thinking around things such as identity and difference, not just out there, but actually within the profession itself, and think about our roles and responsibilities to create a clinical psychology that is fit for purpose, really. So having equity at its heart as well. And in that light, taking really seriously that psychology and clinical psychology is as much about action as it is about thinking and feeling. Okay. Yeah, that's my paperwork running. To give you a quick tour then, the book comes in 4 sections, and the first section is quite, as you imagine, the context of clinical psychology, which is probably a good starting point. So as I said earlier, I will weave throughout a bit of an overview of the book, but I want today to perhaps give an opportunity just to have a think about some of the questions at hand that are raised from some of these ideas. So within that, I guess, highlighting what clinical psychologists do anyway, as an overview that takes that kind of critical and creative invitation to rethink and kind of summarise and invite people to consider their roles within making the most of supervision. It seemed quite a rare occurrence to find chapters about being the supervisee as opposed to the supervisor. So this is again an invitation of how can we participate in that kind of supervisory dance, and restoring the journey. So really thinking about that journey towards training and the differences that come with that, the challenges that come with that. Some of the ideas around, do we aspire to some sort of mould, or do we break the mould, and things like that. And then each section of the book aspires to end on a more personal, perhaps professional and political kind of reflective piece, shorter, but by no means less punchy, for want of a better phrase. So the end chapter here, everyone reflects, but some reflections are more risky than others, really speaks to some of the kind of dilemmas faced throughout training when you come from perhaps a lens that is in context a minoritized kind of position, whereby perhaps teaching materials or conversations come with kind of loaded assumptions, or assumptions that are just not questioned, or not questioned in the same way as others. I always say I will give a brief spiel of the book and then get carried away. So I could say loads more, but I will carry on now. And what I would like to do for the next part is just invite Lizette to join us again for our kind of first reflective activity. So yeah.
Thanks, James. So one of the things James was just referring to is related to what is perceived as the mold of what a clinical psychologist should be. And I think one of the sadnesses for me in our profession is often that there is a sense that, and Michael White, who is one of the originators of narrative therapy, spoke about this quite a lot, about how we sort of expected to leave all we know from our personal life experiences at the door and sort of start clinical psychology as a blank slate, and then get shaped and molded into what a proper clinical psychologist should be. And what I've really appreciated about the standpoint of this book is really a challenge to that. And I guess one could often remind yourself that every new person coming into our profession slightly stretches and shifts and changes and extends and enriches what that mold can be. And so that mold can never become static. So we wanted to just connect you all to your own personal versions of that truth. And so I hope you have a piece of paper handy and a pen. And we're going to ask you to consider the question. This was a question that comes from John Winslade, who's also somebody more from the narrative therapy tradition. And he asked potential and future trainees to write a response to the question. This is who I am as an aspiring clinical psychologist, and this is what I'm trying to do in the world. And so we want you to just consider how you might answer that question. Now, you can't go off and write an essay now because we don't have enough time for that. But we have a couple of questions just to guide you on the next slide. So maybe you could ask yourself, which aspects of my selfhood brought me into this work? Or maybe consider, what are the ways of being in my work that I particularly value? Or finally, maybe think about, what did my family and friends say about me that made me think that it was worth spending all this time training in order to do this particular work? Now, you won't have time to consider all of those in great depth, but maybe just take a moment, maybe choose one of them, or see what comes up for you if you consider them collectively. When we were working on this chapter, John Burnham spoke about maybe the family stories about him that was in his family of origin that sort of extended an invitation towards the helping professions. And so maybe that's what I'm asking of you as well. I think Zoom silences are very weird, but I'm going to give you just a minute of sort of reflection and maybe thinking about what comes up for you in terms of this question about who I am and what work I want to do in the world. So I think different people tend to come at this differently. For some, that's a narrative, a story that's being told. For others, there would be bubbles and arrows and drawings and pictures involved. And maybe this will be of interest to you, and maybe after tonight's webinar, you will find a quiet moment to consider it further and to think about how the mold of clinical psychology would look slightly differently for having you in there, and what work that could do in the world, what ripples it can cause. So James, shall we leave people to ponder that a little bit for themselves further, and you can uh, carry us forward sort of in the meantime, and we can leave that with people.
It's interesting. I imagine revisiting these questions at different points will bring new meaning to them, won't they? I'm just thinking of that last one there. I'm thinking of my cat map within the book about being a thinker, not a talker, was the family script about me. I'm thinking, has that lent to me perhaps writing a book, maybe just doing what I'm thinking. Thank you, Lizette. Okay. So I just wanted to storm through a bit of a section of the book here that really captures for me the heart of some of the ideas and the motifs in the book. So surviving clinical psychology offers a seat in an overly distracted and often damaging world. From here, you might uncover clinical psychology's greatest swindle, that to achieve more, you must do more. However, this only serves to perpetuate the individualizing cogs that disentangle you from the web of support and community that is within an arm's reach. So this book calls on you to reach out to one another and to support one another, to create a sense of community throughout these turbulent times and testing terrains. And so to continue the kind of weaving of the themes throughout the book, the second section of the book considers the personal, so the selves as human. In the first chapter within there, it really explores this idea of sitting on both sides of the desk. The second chapter really starts to think about values in practice, to bring in social justice and justice doing to our lives and our work, in which I'll introduce a kind of thinking space exercise from this chapter in a moment as well. The idea here, I think I was speaking to Jackie, who heads the chapter here, in some of the kind of the process of collaborating on this book as well, in terms of navigating our ways through ideas. Even if from my end as an editor, I came in with this sense of a real focus on allyship, but then through the processes of kind of navigating through some of the contentions and some of the challenges around what does it mean to become an ally, other times where that isn't appropriate, and so there's a whole process embedded throughout that kind of journey that could be creative and curious kind of thing, and critical, but and also playful, but yet serious too. So there's a chapter as well in which the exploration of kind of personal therapy through training is held in the spotlight, and this really almost interestingly takes on the role of a kind of dialogue back and forth from at the time 2 trainees within my cohort, and as guided and kind of interviewed by the curiosity of a assistant psychologist at the time too. I know this is a recurring kind of debate and topic area for clinical psychology, particularly for training. Should the idea of personal therapy be mandatory throughout the process? So they touch on some of that. And then we've got the fabulous Danny, who joins for the end reflective chapter, in which you kind of reflect on the idea of navigating some of the professional domains. And I really found that interesting when I thought around Danny's kind of work context of kind of being a peer worker at the time too, and the kind of sense of identities being prescribed by job roles and how you navigate that, which I think you'll touch a bit on later as well, Danny, right? I won't do what I did on one of these webinars and just chuck you right in it by saying, "Oh, Danny, come and tell us all about that bit," without giving you the prep.
Very grateful.
I've got a bit of an exercise for people too. So this should have came with a bit of a a pre-warning to have gone to, I don't know, the Works or Hobbycraft or something to buy a heck of a lot of paper. You obviously don't need paper. You could do it perhaps on your phone or something. But if you do happen to have a piece of paper by you, I wonder, like, imagine you were writing a letter to someone, perhaps a good pal, and you wanted to fold it into three. That would be magical. And if I had a pen, I have a pen. I would scribble the heading. Oh, where's my camera? Personal on top. So we're thinking about these different sections of the book. And what I would like to invite you to do, if you have found that piece of paper, or maybe you could just hold it in mind. Perhaps think if you would describe your personal self, your personal self's kind of characteristics, strengths, skills. Just perhaps pick 3 words that would capture that personal sense of self, and scribble those down if you can. And I'll try and do that now as well. Though I do have a Blue Peter style prepared earlier version when it comes to the end slide. Okay. Naturally, if you haven't found yourself with 3 words yet, you've got a little bit of a space to keep on thinking. Okay, so I've flicked that there. I mentioned this values in practice kind of exercise thinking space. For this, I'm not going to ask you to take this moment to think about the topic area or experiences. I think this is a really meaningful and really important exercise to participate in. But I wonder whether, given this virtual kind of webinar domain we're in, it might be one to think and plan in some time where you can just be mindful of kind of feeling safe and you have your kind of personal resources available to you, perhaps with people that you trust and that you can relate to, debrief and have a real kind of conversation with. Or it might be that you participate in that yourself, but have that space where you can write that down. Because I'm mindful that some of the questions could bring up some difficult experiences as well. So the first thing that comes to mind is always just to perhaps have that pause moment so you can think about creating a kind of safe space for exercises. I think this is really pertinent to lots of the kind of societal challenges we face, and some of the thinking that my friends and kind of colleagues within this chapter really push us towards is kind of considering that time where perhaps you felt unsafe or emotionally vulnerable. Kind of, I've added within training here to be more specific to this idea of what training can become, perhaps with a kind of sense of thinking around that safety too. But as you can see, with the questions here would be asking yourself around, was anyone there for you to notice and stand up for you or with you during that time of a lack of safety? What did that person do that made a difference for you in that situation? What would you have liked someone to do, say, that wasn't done or said? And importantly, I guess, what has that experience or your experience taught you about the value of being alongside others? And this exercise really gets at the heart, I think, of our kind of relational responsibility, our kind of relational care, collective kind of solidarity, of which the world appears to chuck many kind of challenges to that idea of connectedness with one another, and that sense of community being challenged at different times. So in that light, when I speak of this, I guess it's easy to always speak of others, and I don't want to fall into that trap. I want I say trap because that's part of the problem sometimes, to locate difficulties, contentions outside of our own kind of realm. So I just wanted to highlight, and this symbolises as well something of that evolving kind of nature of the book and the ideas within. Is this continuation of thinking and applying lots of these ideas elsewhere. So I think just highlighting the clinical psychology's participation in some of these areas that we ought to really be addressing and changing. I would hope that with you all participating today and creating that psychological landscape for the future, potentially these are some examples of the areas where we can start to shift things for the better, really. So I'm talking here, and of these references here are just for example, really. There's plenty of other kind of people highlighting and raising these issues. Firstly, I'm highlighting some of the work really around racism within clinical psychology, and which has been particularly pertinent within the UK kind of training community within the last year, but of course also reflective of lots of societal shifts more broadly as well. Likewise, sexual harassment and concerns around sexism within clinical psychology. I put here my reference here is browser Twitter for a few minutes, because there's so many accusations of wokeism just to silence any conversations around social justice, and to silence any sense of kind of navigating domains of identity within social sciences. And then there comes a real hostility with that kind of impressive power, dare I say, from David Smale's ideas there. It's almost like a smothering of the potential for dialogue and debate. Again, speaking to many of the values and conversations within the book, for far too long, as I put here, lived experience has been tolerated rather than kind of valued. So, example here of a recent Division of Clinical Psychology kind of publicised guidance for clinical training around valuing of lived experience as opposed to tolerating. So in this light, where identity is an area of contention and apparent contention anyway, in a sense of invitations and unhelpful invitations to really horrendous misapplications of power within so many pockets of society, including clinical psychology, it inherently highlights that the personal is political, which is at the heart of this text and the ideas within. So with that in mind, I'd like to now pass on to Sasha and Danny to explore the idea of lived experience a bit further.
Okay, so I'll just start with a little mini introduction, because quite a big part of what me and Danny are going to talk about is, I guess, how we introduce ourselves. So like James said, we're just going to think a little bit about talking about the personal and political voicing of lived experience, in terms of how it can be often externalized as something that's not relevant for us, but it very much is. So myself and Danny are going to start with thinking about who are we, and how else could we position ourselves. And we've already introduced ourselves, and probably when I came up and said who I was, I didn't really give much thought to what I said. I said I was a trainee, and there are so many different ways that I could have introduced myself. But there's something about this context and my sort of professional role, which made me introduce myself as a trainee. But there are obviously lots of other ways that I could have positioned myself. I don't know if you want to say anything else about that, Danny.
Yeah, I was thinking, why did I introduce myself the same way? But I think it's probably novelty, isn't it? It's only been about a month, so it's still like, oh, I'm a trainee, something to say about myself. I think when I started, well, yeah, it was a few years ago now, wasn't it? When we were doing the book, I was in a peer worker role. So I think it's changed over time. But also, I suppose it depends on the context. Yeah, something about feeling like I needed to legitimise myself, saying something about clinical psychology when I hadn't finished my psychology degree. So yeah, I think it has changed over time. But I suppose it also makes me think about Jo Hemmingfield works for the DCP, the Division of Clinical Psychology, as an expert by experience, but she also used to work in the office next door to me when I was in Sheffield. And one of the things that we always used to talk about was research to do with peer workers having like a liminal identity and in-between identity where they're not quite one thing and not quite the other. And she always used to be like, what's it got to do with my identity? Like, my work is something I do, it's not who I am. But I think that's not, or it doesn't always feel like the case in clinical psychology. It's like, I am a clinical psychologist. And I think especially at, when you're trying to get onto training, there's this sense that who you are has to fit the way you think and feel and come across, has to fit this type, and that's how you get on. So yeah, I suppose I introduced myself as a trainee, but on Twitter I think I still have former peer worker, because I guess it sort of speaks to my values and the things that more who I am as a person and what I hope to bring to my work, I guess. More so maybe than former research assistant does.
Okay. I think what you said there about kind of, there's something about I think there's something almost about the funnel of training. There's something about the context that we're in that almost feels as though we end up positioning ourselves as all being very, very similar, because it feels like you need to be a particular something to join this very sort of unique, difficult to get into group. And I think the really sad part of that is that it excludes a lot of other narratives about ourselves that probably give us a lot of the strengths that we have as individuals. So when I was thinking about doing this presentation, I thought about how I put together my application for training. And I think some of the things that I said were probably these things. So the narratives that I could tell about myself are that I attended private school from about the age of 6 onwards. I got 3 A's at A level. I got a first in my psychology degree. I became a trainee clinical psychologist, and I published stuff. And I'm pretty sure that all of these things are on my application, and they are the things that I shared. And it makes me sound great in some way, shape or form. But it's very much a very narrow view of who I am. But this tends to, despite it being a narrow view, it tends to be the narrative that I've thickened. But aside from that, I've also grown up in a family context with a single parent, and my mum had sort of mental health difficulties and physical disabilities. I had a diagnosis of panic disorder when I was 14. I had quite a lot of difficulties at school between the age of 11 and 15. I also had a diagnosis of anorexia when I was 16. Our family home was repossessed when I was 19. A traumatic event and PTSD diagnosis when I was 27. So this perhaps creates a more complete picture of who I am, and a more complete picture of what's made me who I am, my values, my ethos, what is really together produce the human being that sort of stands before you, I guess. But unfortunately, there's something about the context that we're in that has resulted in me just continuing to thicken this very perfect, idealized narrative, which excludes a massive part of what it means to be a human being. And I think that silencing that has been quite problematic at times. And I felt very much silenced by that. And I've thought about what has led me to silence these parts of myself. And I do think it's something within our profession. I do think it's something within our social context as well. I think it's something to do with the scripts that I've internalized over time. So these are some of the things that I've heard who have been said to me that I think have stayed with me and have shaped the reason why maybe I just focus on those very maybe acceptable parts of myself in terms of sort of socially acceptable parts of myself. So one of the things that I've heard within training is it's easier to work with sexual abuse because we're so unlikely to experience it. And hearing that on training had a huge impact, I think, on me in terms of what was expected of me. Who am I meant to be? What do you expect me to be? What do you expect me to experience? What is it okay to say within this room? And that's something that's really sort of, for somebody else might not have struck something with it. For me, it really struck a chord in terms of what my identity should be. A very well-intentioned supervisor once said to me, once it's out there, you can't take it back. So you need to be cautious. So I think that's something that's also stuck with me. And I think it was a well-intentioned protective statement. But there's something about embodying, there's something about disclosure. Disclosure is a statement that you disclose certain, oh, Danny, I've just been distracted by your cat. Sorry, it's majestic. Something else that I've heard on training is, how do you leave your stuff at the door? I don't know, we've all got stuff. Do we need to leave it at the door? I found that really confusing. I don't know what stuff is. I don't know what we should be leaving at the door. I don't know who makes these rules, but apparently there are some rules that we need to be aware of that I would challenge, perhaps. We hear a lot of, to help us understand X, here's a case study. I was in training today, we were talking about anger, and we could have used a lot of our own experiences of anger, but that kind of didn't happen. And have you ever worked with X? And X can often be our own experiences. So, yeah.
Yeah, so sort of in a similar vein, I think having moved from a lived experience role, to other roles, there's something about the different ways that you're categorized and what's expected of you. So it wasn't so much that there was an alternative narrative that I feel like I'm related to differently, or what's expected of me is different, and it's quite specific. It doesn't necessarily encompass me as a whole person. And I suppose sometimes that kind of positioning is helpful. I'm thinking of when I was doing my peer, like we did training, and Sue Sibbald, who's brilliant, she's a sort of campaigner and activist, and she worked in our trust, peer expert, and she did a lot of work with us. But we spent so long talking about how we talk about our own experiences and when we would share and what we'd be comfortable with, and sort of practicing in a way that felt safe. And to be honest, in the role, it just wasn't, very rarely, if ever, felt like it was needed, because it was more about how people felt they could relate to you differently. You could say something and the way it was received, people were like, this means something different when you say it, because I know that you've lived it. And I suppose that's why it's so important in a way, because it often gets sort of compared to being, self-disclosure. It's what we give away of ourselves to people, but actually sometimes it's just how giving people a chance to perceive us differently or relate to us in a different way. So on here I've got kind of like my graduate role, being graduate, being an AP, being a mental health professional, and then on the other hand being a peer worker, service user, because that's always like the next thing that's said, even though, for me, I spent way more time trying to access services than I did using them. And my mental health, for me, I don't really define it at all by my relationship with services, but there's that perceived, this is the funnel that you fit into. And for many people, I think, especially people in these kinds of roles, it doesn't acknowledge all the other skills that you bring with you, that you draw on. It's not just these are the only experiences I'm using. You're using all sorts of skills. And I think I've talked about work, but I guess if I was talking to somebody else that knew me and I just asked them to describe me, I think probably they'd mention the cats. I'm a bit of a cat mum, but they are cute. There's this one and there's another one, Cleo, but she's downstairs somewhere. And I always find when I say that, people are like, other cat parents are like, yes, I know exactly what you mean. It's an instant thing of like, yes, I too am a cat parent, very serious responsibility. So I think in some senses the things that we relate over as people, or the commonalities, aren't really anything to do with those things. I remember a woman who it meant a lot more to her about me and whether or not I was trustworthy that I also had a large cat. Just for her, that was more important. Like, than my, you know, mental health background or my professional background. She felt like she could be on a level with me because we had that. So I suppose the point is that we, with others and with ourselves, I think we try and kind of box ourselves off in terms of what we do rather than who we are. And I suppose the consequence of that is that we end up with environments that aren't necessarily welcoming to people that don't fit within these roles, that don't kind of acknowledge all the things that are integral to who we are, even though we definitely bring these things with us. You know, I don't stop being a cat mum when I'm at work, although I don't talk about it as much. Probably do now, actually, now that I'm on Teams and the cats are always in my lap. But yeah. So I've done a similar thing to Sasha in terms of scripts that I've internalized, and I think a lot of them reflect what I was just talking about. So they're kind of like the flip between, I guess, messages maybe that I hear from other kind of professionals, and things that I would hear in my peer role, and the difference between them and the conflict and why. Because one of the things, me and Sasha met actually when she first started training. We were in the same office, which was really fortunate. But one of the things we ended up talking about was how the role you're in kind of gives or takes away permission to talk about certain things. So in my role, there was very much an expectation that I was a representative of, you know, someone who had used services, and that I would be expected to talk about that. And there was a certain expectation that came with that, or for people to relate to me as someone who could understand their experiences from that perspective, that there wasn't for Sasha in a trainee role. And that's maybe not explicit, but it's certainly communicated, I think, in a lot of different ways. And I suppose the downside for that is that if you're in a lived experience role, there's this sense that you are there to tell your story. I luckily wasn't in a role that was like that, but I think in general, people expect that from you, this kind of commodification of your story, your background, and this idea that you kind of come in and speak and then go, and then other people who have more power than you make decisions about what happens as a result, and you know, you're a motivating factor, but you're not a decision maker that's in the room. And I guess that's summed up really by this next one. I did some training. It was around the diagnosis of personality disorder. It was for students about to go on their first mental health placement, and it was really this training session had been going for a while, and it tried to cover like all the different personality disorder diagnosis in the DSM. And I don't know when people last looked, but I swear there's like 14. I can't remember the exact number, and some of them I'd never heard before. And the students would take them and like write them down and ask like, and what's the difference between this and this? Because they're like in exam mode, you know, they want to pass exams. And one of the things that I did was kind of work with some of the people to really like rethink that and think about what's important, which is knowing about what helps people in stress, how to respond to people, the reasons that they might be feeling the way that they're feeling, and what that's like. And somebody commented, who was kind of watching the session, like, oh, you know, in your role, I thought they could have used you a bit more there. So because I hadn't talked about my circumstances specifically, or gone into, you know, details of, you know, here I was, and then I did this, and then I did this. It was almost like, oh, well, you haven't used, you know, ignoring the power dynamics. If they could have used you more there. Like, I'm not an equal participant in it. There's also this sense of my contributions in terms of the shaping and the design and the resources and everything else that went into it, coming from my perspective, and me thinking what would have helped me to hear from, you know, what would I want someone to know. That was sort of ignored because it was like, well, your role is to come in and to talk. But then obviously the swing side of that is, you know, oh yeah, people with PD don't have any boundaries, you know, the sort of things that you hear that would make me think I can't say anything about anything because I don't want to fit this like mold that people have. So I have to really, you know, not do that, not fit people's expectations, which I think even affected the way I socialise with my colleagues. And people saying, yeah, you shouldn't be sharing anything at all. If you do, then you've slipped up. People shouldn't know anything about you at all. So in the one breath, I was expected to lay everything out, and in the next, I shouldn't say anything. So I guess it's this idea that like self-disclosure is something specific and something you say, and something that you say to a client, which is not. I guess I don't see acknowledging the different aspects of my experiences as a self-disclosure. That's just me being authentic, me being myself and open about my experiences and the value that I think that they bring for me personally. And I guess for me, there's lots of other ways is people disclose things about themselves without saying anything. So, you know, when you misinterpret something somebody said and you clarify it and you're doing it based on your experiences and you get it wrong, like, people know something about you from that. I'm thinking of my boyfriend worked as a court usher, and I think once one of the judges paused in a witness testimony to ask what an ASDA was, and then to ask what a 2 up, 2 down was. And I think, like, that's a huge disclosure about yourself and your background, but we encourage you to ask questions and to think, and all of these assumptions that we bring into the room that we are in with people involves, you know, people are learning things about us and our experiences. So this idea that you can leave them outside the door, I think, is wrong. And actually, by trying to be that sort of neutral blank slate, all you're doing is kind of closing the door for people who don't see themselves in the profession or see themselves in the people that they work with. So yeah, it's just maintaining barriers, I think. Although we've mentioned before, it can sound like when we talk about this stuff that we're saying that everybody should be talking about, you know, their mental health difficulties, and actually there's lots of barriers for people that already have barriers in the profession, especially, and it can be risky, and you might not have the support available to do that. So that's not necessarily what we're promoting so much, is that we can all be pushing to create environments that open themselves up to the potential for others to do that if and when they feel comfortable, rather than closing it down. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Danny. I really relate to a lot of those reflections, and I think in the next slide we sort of talk about this. I think a lot of what you said is just related to this illusionary distinction between noble us and troubled them, and so there's some sort of distinction there that is somehow inherently perpetuated within the field. I think the idea that we do disclose, the idea that there is we talk about certain things as being a disclosure, and I think that just the idea that to talk about your mental health or to talk about yourself is a disclosure, says something about how we perceive that, and it remains some sort of relational risk. You're departing from the norm of what's expected from you, you're departing from some sort of neutrality, neutral position. And I think we've both sort of in our conversations together have spoken about kind of how this is this sort of funneling of identity to fit the perfect mould, and a lot of subtle signs and signals that we get tell us that this is the perfect mould. And like Danny said, we met through a job where Danny was a peer support worker, and coming in as a trainee, I was like, there's a job for that. There's a role that is distinguished for that, to talk about personal experiences. What does that communicate to the rest of the team about their responsibility? And I think we've both tried, or both sort of experienced, trying to find this both and position of being a psychologist and having experiences of distress. And I think as I'm sort of talking, I almost feel as though, like, well, why isn't that the norm? Why isn't that a given? Why isn't that completely understandable that we're human beings? But there are so many different ways that is sorted out through the processes that we go through. I don't know if you want to say anything more on that, Danny, but we've sort of got a quote to end on.
Yeah, no, I'm happy for. I talked quite a lot there, didn't I? I was realising that when I stopped. Carry
on. I'll just read out this quote then to sort of summarise, I think, a lot of what we've spoken about. So, all of these stories make me who I am, but to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that form me. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is that they are untrue, that they are incomplete, and that they make one story, and they become the only story. Sorry, I just had to move you around in order to read the quote. But if people want to view the TED Talk that quote comes from, there's a sort of screenshot there for you to go and have a little look. Okay, I'm going to bring James back.
Thank you. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Sasha. we've established quite a good little group here. Lizette, Danny, Sasha and I, we've done this a few times and it evolves and kind of changes each time. It's quite exciting in that way. And particularly the arrival of different animals. So I was very tempted to bring our chihuahua on screen, but maybe she'll make a show in a little while. So to continue the overview, weaving the sense of what kind of subjects we do explore throughout the text. This third section of the book is the professional, so the use of self in clinical psychology. And so this chapter here, I don't know, did you want to dip in here, Lizette, to give a bit of a flavour for the Taking the Plunge chapter? Or do you want to entrust me to just give us a little summary there?
Well, I guess it sort of makes the point that all aspects of our identity, and we use John's sense of the social graces, so our gender and our sexuality and our gender identity and our class background all come with us through the door as we enter the clinical psychology spaces. And John and I just explore together how these often offer us huge opportunities, but also can offer us restraints that we need to be reflexive of and use supervision for, to think about. And so I guess it sort of connects with Danny and Sasha, what you were saying about the impossibility of leaving any parts of ourselves at the door, and using the richness of all of ourselves, but just also just always being so thoughtful about how those all intersect with one another, and what invitations they extend to us in our work as clinical psychologists.
Thank you. So there's also the sense of kind of applying our skills in kind of psychological formulation, and invitation to kind of experiment with psychological formulation on perhaps someone we know reasonably well, at the very least, hopefully very well, but maybe the tool in itself would be an invitation to get to know yourself a bit more. So yeah, I'm talking about ourselves, and throughout my journey, took me a little while to get onto training, probably half of the waffle that you may be witnessing right now. But throughout that journey, I kind of formulated myself using multiple models, and didn't take it easy when it came to this book either. So challenged myself to even take that further. So within this chapter, there's my self-formulation too. Also, this an idea very close to kind of my heart, and I imagine Lizette's heart too, is this pebbles in palms motif kind of analogy that me and my colleagues, friends, partners, we all kind of conjured together this analogy around how we can help a person as much as kind of change the world. And in this chapter, kind of sought to apply that to the training journey as well, to think about the multiple layers of kind of intervention and how we can hold on to hope through quite testing, kind of challenging times. And then to kind of end this section of the book, there's an exploration of the selfhood within the kind of lecture hall. So we have an undergraduate student and lecturer kind of navigating their way through their similarities, differences, visibilities, and opportunities of voicing those different sides of identity, and how they can work together through that. So earlier, I got you to fold a piece of paper if you had one to hand. So I'd like you to take that piece of paper again, and this time round, as we put personal onto the top of the header for that section last time. If we can put this time, professional, and my request doesn't get any more complicated this time around. What I'd like you to kind of have a think about are 3 characteristics, qualities, skills perhaps that would give us an insight into that kind of professional self or professional selves. Okay. Okay. And then we can just place that to one side. We will return. And so we come to this idea of just focusing in on an idea that might be quite useful for the road ahead. It's just to give you a flavour and an invitation again, is this sense of, as I say, practicing what we preach, to apply those kind of formulation ideas to ourselves. So this is just a kind of, I don't know, background, kind of behind the scenes. There we go, that's the phrase I'm looking for. A picture of my own formulation as I was on the dining table trying to process where my own way of relating to self, others, and the world kind of comes from. It's that kind of headline kind of script of Think and Not Talk. I'm trying to make sense of that within the book. So this is just an example to give you a kind of flavour of the process that can unfold when you start to engage in different models, different mediums to think through selfhood, really. And that's one of the areas we explore within the book. I think it continues to evolve when things go further. As I say, it's like a springboard, this idea from the book. So I'm going to invite Sasha back in as well to just give another flavour of these similar ideas about how you could apply that idea of self-formulation to help engage with this idea of what clinical psychology can become.
Okay, so I guess thinking about what me and Danny were saying earlier and thinking about the scripts that I've internalised, I think that this is something that I've sort of started to scribble whilst I was in one of my lectures on training around how I experienced the sense of being on training and also having sort of my own experiences that maybe I wanted to invite into the room but felt like I couldn't. And I was trying to make sense of why I couldn't. What is it that's stopping me? And I started thinking CAT terms. I think it was CAT teaching that I was in. So I thought about what was I experiencing? What was in there? Within CAT, you have a kind of a top role and a bottom role. So how am I relating to the world around me? What am I experiencing others as? And I remember feeling that I was experiencing others as very expecting, quite cautious of who I was and assessing. And I imagine some trainees might relate to this. Training is inevitably a kind of a process of being assessed to some degree. But I realised that it left me feeling at times quite judged and ashamed and silenced in relation to certain parts of myself. I thought about what is my aim here? What is it that I'm trying to escape from these feelings? And I think the aim is to try and be a good psychologist, as that is determined by professional ideals. So the messages that I was getting around what is it to be a good psychologist meant that parts of myself felt quite judged. And the assumption I think that was underlying that is if I disclose, going back to that idea of disclosure as being quite a loaded term, I'm very vulnerable to judgment and people judging those parts of myself. So the action is that I silence myself and I sit here in this room and I don't talk about parts of me that are very relevant and maybe are shouting to want to get out and sort of be present. And the consequence of that is increased shame and self-judgment. I'm always starting to do to myself what I see others as doing to me. I'm starting to judge and internalise that sense of this isn't an okay part of myself to share. But the evaluation ends up being that by being silent, I'm kind of safe. At least I haven't disclosed. At least I haven't shared that part of myself and put myself in a vulnerable position. But ultimately, that still reinforces that sense of that part of me could be judged and I should be ashamed of it, and I need to be silent. So this was the loop that I sort of started to sort of map out when I was thinking about what is it about this situation I'm in that makes me feel like I can't talk about parts of myself. So in CAT, you think about exits. What can I do differently? Part of it was just reflectively writing on this and doing this exercise. So just mapping out this process was really cathartic and helped me understand what was going on. What was going on from outside, what were the pressures, what was my own internal dialogue that was influencing the process. Part of it was starting to reconnect with my personal values as well as my professional ideals. We can get really funneled into just connecting with professional ideals, and I think it's really important to continue to pull in your personal values and not be kind of, not be silenced and not have parts of you written off and erased. Another big exit for me was to seek alternative narratives and allies. And I think sometimes I meet somebody and I feel as though immediately I can tell they're an ally. I think that when I met Danny, that was one of those experiences for me. And those people really do sustain you, and they kind of remind you that there are other people out there that feel and think in the same way that you do. I started to experiment with safe disclosure. So thinking about kind of starting to push the boundary a little bit and start to see what I can talk about and do that maybe with the people that I feel safest with first. Use an awful lot of compassion. Compassion about your own experiences, compassion about the way that you feel about those. And start to curiously question those assumptions of, am I really expected to be noble us anyway? I think there are a lot of psychologists that don't want us to be noble us, and they want us to invite the personal parts of ourselves, and they value that. So these are my exits, and this is my self-formulation. Is that okay?
I think hearing you speak through that again, I think it speaks to perhaps figuring out, or the importance of that kind of anchor, the kind of where values kind of anchor us throughout lots of the different challenges, and perhaps that's something that can kind of connect us when it's something around a collective care, so being able to find those allies or being able to connect to our own sense of self through kind of reflective writing and positioning ourselves in that way. So it really speaks, and this is why the person was political, and that's why the whole book looks to inject, bring politics to the kind of personal and professional development of clinical psychology. So here is just one of the endorsements that it was just really humbling to kind of receive back, and I just had to revisit this recently and just thought, wow, it's a sense that perhaps this book has something to offer beyond training as well. And lots of people said how they kind of revisit some of the activities and ideas in there. I just thought Tanya Byron saying 30 years melted away and now I feel fresh and eager to rethink, revisit, revise and review. If this book does that for a 52-year-old, still loving the privilege of working in mental health services, but somewhat jaded, then this book will invigorate and inspire anyone who cares about mental health. And kind of pulls this to it's not only, it's about what we could do and together can do, must and will do. So in that light, the kind of final section of the book is all about the political, the selves and politics in practice. So one of the chapters here is around power in practice, a question in psychiatric diagnosis, in which there's an exploration of the different positions we may take in regards to psychiatric diagnosis, the different experiences of receiving psychiatric diagnosis, and how we work with that within clinical psychology. Taking power into context as well, so working in different organisational contexts and settings, and the pushes and pulls that particular contexts may impart upon us, such as kind of working in a research setting or academic setting, versus perhaps more of a community approach using clinical psychology's ideas to be more outreaching. There's also a chapter here really that really pushes this idea that we're not just all about delivering therapy. It's this thinking around ourselves in our communities. And again, it takes you on quite a journey. There's personal accounts from some of the authors in there, say, of personal experience of being in care versus an experience of several decades of receipt of psychiatric care, or I think they would perhaps put that as care and really question some of those experiences and the approach of services in that way. So it really gets to the heart of some of the challenges that some of this thinking can bring as well. And kind of almost the kind of penultimate ending of the book as well is that reflective kind of conversation between some trainees at the time. So this personal weight of political practice, which really kind of weighs up the pros and cons of engaging with lots of these different ideas, and trying to challenge ourselves within that kind of training domain. So if I can once again pull your attention to your folded piece of paper, I'd like you to finally write down political. And as I invited you earlier to do, just write down 3 words that may capture your character or your quality or your skills around a kind of your perceived kind of political selves as well. Okay. And then what I'd like you to do, if you do have a piece of paper, is to fold that out again. Perhaps consider each of these kind of qualities. So this is my Blue Peter version that I did earlier on the screen. But it's that kind of sense of, well, what if our political selves and our personal selves could have a conversation? What could that lend to our role as a clinical psychologist? Well, what would our professional self say to that collaboration, and what way could they influence the next time we go into the office and we find there's a tricky conversation that makes us feel uncomfortable? Who could we pull on to perhaps lend us some skills to rethink our contribution or participation in that moment? Could this open up new possibilities for our participation in what clinical psychology can become? In what way can we invite these different selves into the training realm as well? Okay, we've not got too much left to go, so we're almost drawing to a close today, but I think this is really quite an important kind of thinking space to bring us to as we nearly reach the end, is this sense of building bridges. Like one of the thinking spaces earlier, I won't necessarily ask you to grab another piece of paper or to write anything down, but it might be just something to be mindful of, and to just hold in mind and think about this invitation here. And this is from, as I put at the bottom here, the chapter, It's Not Just Therapy. So this quote here: civilization is the process in which one gradually increases the number of people involved in the term we or us, and at the same time decreases those labelled as you or them, until that category has no one left in it. And so from that quote, it's just a real invitation, because what Steve and his kind of co-authors say here is that it can be easy to preach to converted or hold close to those similar views of our own. But if we're to build stronger communities, we need to see ourselves as also connected to those who hold very different views or values to us. So how can we do this more as individuals and as a profession as well? And it's these kind of questions, these kind of thinkings within clinical psychology just makes it very tricky for me to see how we can really separate the personal, professional and political. So I guess it's quite fitting that I kind of draw the book to a similar conclusion, that it's an inescapable truth that where the personal and professional meet, the political comes to the fore. This is a drawing someone called Ben Ellsworth kindly kind of contributed towards the book. And I'll leave you to kind of do the kind of interpretation or make sense of that as well. But I guess it's almost ironic, isn't it, that we're talking about these selves of clinical psychology, yet this book is talking about being outreaching. It almost feels like perhaps an oxymoron at first glance, and actually it's got this systemic idea that it's one way of intervening, I guess, and that there's a journey that takes place and that's evolving and changing. So holding a reflective focusing on the selves in practice on one hand, whilst also holding the fact that we must also reach out, connect and seek change through solidarity actions on the other, is exactly what this book is trying to get to. So it's an inescapable truth that where the personal professional meet, the political comes to the fore. For the suspension of self is an unconvincing theatrical trick, a game of power that fuels a disingenuous exchange of misery for expertise that trivializes, devalues, and subtly oppresses the person and context. By playing the suspended self-expert role, I deem the therapy room only fit for furthering disconnection to emotions, identity, and communities, lacking relational depth in favour of the intellectualising and problematizing of being human. I wonder what this expectation of suspension tells us about fragility, pain, and suffering. Is it that pain must be kept at a distance to selfhood? Is suffering infectious? Must the other protect their personal selves from witnessing and connecting with fragility on a human level? The therapy room can be a scary place, but we perhaps got it wrong, the wrong way around, if it is the therapist that finds himself having to defend against the vulnerability of being seen. This endeavour of visibility is a political means to re-participation in life, or re-participation perhaps in clinical psychology. So the book kind of concludes an ending of sorts, but it's a fallible idea, this sense of endings, because it's really kind of the beginnings of something. So this is kind of a screenshot of a tissue that came from a session where we'd run out of the availability of paper, and I was with an 8-year-old who inspired me a lot. And she kind of taught me that sense of the importance of relationships and the importance of that creative, kind of curious, playful, but really quite serious approach to our work. And she told me, just stop talking and start to dance. So we blooming did, and we danced our hearts out in that moment. And she kind of sits with me wherever I go. So she's perhaps in my kind of club of life, contributing towards the kind of practice that I engage in. And I thought it only fitting that the book kind of draws to that close, because in her kind of, or as I say, the 8-year-old kind of lens in the world, when we talk about psychology as action, we're talking about just stopping talking and starting to dance. So I think we ought to take this really seriously. And just, I guess, for reference there, if you were interested and you want to dive into the book, there's a discount code there for Routledge. And I guess we've got references here. I'd really like to invite people in a moment to ask any questions, share their reflections, or albeit kind of share that online as well via the kind of hashtag or getting in contact with any of us. I'd also like to thank all the people who contributed to the book, because it's nothing without them, and it's nothing without people participating in the ideas too. as we kind of shape and take this forward. So I'm really looking forward to kind of continuing to hear people's perspectives on things, whether that's exciting perspectives, critical perspectives, or just ones that kind of take us somewhere different and somewhere new. And I'd love to hear how that takes shape in kind of Ireland as well. And thank you.